Well, now let's take a look at graphing aggregate supply and talking about aggregate supply. But before we get to aggregate supply, earlier you learned about aggregate demand, which was showing different goods and services demanded at different price levels. Aggregate supply is looking at goods and services supplied by firms at different price levels. So as we draw any good graph, we have to label it. The vertical axis is labeled PL for price level. The horizontal is RGDP, or real output. Now, we're going to look at two different ranges. The first range we're going to look at is a horizontal range, also known as immediate range, Keynesian range, or fixed price range. And one of the factors or interesting aspects of this range, as you can see, is as our GDP increases or moves to the right, there is no change in the price level. Or we can say due to the fixed price of inputs. When we look at the next range, and again, we'll correctly draw PL, price level, RGDP, real output. In the second range, it is upward sloping, also known as the intermediate range. And if you look at the intermediate range, what we can see is as the price level increases, so does the output increase. And what we have happen is that as this price level increases, real wages decrease, which allows for this increase in real GDP. Now, when we look at a graph, this curve here, we can have shifts of the curve. The curve can shift to the left, which would be a decrease in aggregate supply, or we can have a shift to the right, which would be an increase in aggregate supply. Now, an example of this could be a change in one of the determinants. And one might ask, what are these determinants? I like to use the acronym or the idea of Mr. Pibb. P stands for productivity, I, input prices, and B, business taxes and business regulations. Now when we're looking at aggregate supply curve, the upward sloping intermediate range, the curve itself can move. And so I'd like to talk about some examples of either an increase or a decrease in aggregate supply. If there's a change in input prices, for example, a change in the price of oil, if the price of oil were to increase, we would see a leftward shift of the supply curve. And what we see in this leftward shift of the supply curve is that we are producing less at each price level. On the other hand, if we see a change in an input, for example, of a decrease in the price of steel or a decrease in the price of wages, we will see a rightward shift of the aggregate supply curve, showing an increase in supply, and we are now able to produce more real GDP at each price level. As the price level will decrease, we are still able to produce more at each price level. Next, we'll look at long-run aggregate supply.